Turning now to the Trayvon Martin case, now that George Zimmerman is facing second-degree murder charges, liberal and conservative commentators yet again choosing up sides. Take Fox's Sean Hannity, who seemed to pick apart the criminal case.
Your eyewitness was adamant in saying that he saw Trayvon Martin on top of George Zimmerman beating Mr. Zimmerman. It seems like there might be some overcharging here.
As for MSNBC's Al Sharpton, well, he outdid himself shortly after prosecutor Angela Corey made the announcement of the second-degree murder charges. Reverend Al held a news conference with Trayvon's parents.
Let me say 45 days ago, Trayvon Martin was murdered. No arrest was made.
About an hour later, Sharpton put his media hat back on, interviewing the parents for MSNBC.
I am sitting here at the Washington Convention Center with the parents of Trayvon Martin, and we've just finished a press conference with Attorney Ben Crump after they spoke with the special prosecutor.
Joining us now in New York, Lola Ogunaki, a cultural commentator and former New York Times reporter. And here in Washington, Jane Hall, Associate Professor of Journalism at American University and a former Fox News commentator. Jane Hall, we finally have criminal charges in this case after 6 weeks of media finger-pointing and speculation, actual evidence from law enforcement, and yet it seems to me the commentators have just gone back to their same old arguments.
I think the commentators have. And, you know, Sean Hannity has replayed many times this new Black Panther video of a hate group that put a bounty out on the head of George Zimmerman, and it effectively conflates the peaceful protests, the parents' call for a lack of violence. You know, Fox was late on this story, and now they're trying to talk about a rush to judgment. You know, Reverend Al, you can talk about the ethics of that, but to my mind, to endlessly replay this video is to question the whole press on this case.
Because the new Black Panther Party is a relatively minor fringe group?
They're a minor fringe group. What they did was despicable, but the way it's being replayed on Fox is to conflate peaceful protests and people who were calling for an arrest and a trial in this case.
Lola Ogunaki, do you see the media here playing an inflammatory role as this has become kind of an obsession after the media, of course, spent the first 2 weeks being totally out to lunch on the importance of this fatal shooting of an unarmed teenager?
I don't think they're playing an inflammatory role. In fact, I think they've been responsible for the most part. What you are seeing is that the viewers want more and more news about this very subject. And we are in a position right now in news where it's about law of supply and demand, and the viewers are demanding more and more coverage. If we look at how the network, MSNBC has had 49% of their coverage dedicated to this. CNN has had about 40% of their coverage dedicated to this Trayvon Martin story, and Fox has only had about 15% of their coverage dedicated to this story. So if anything, what you're seeing is maybe Fox needs to play a little catch-up because viewers are not turned off by this story at all. In fact, what you're seeing is that they want more.
But that would suggest that just because viewers want more of a particular story, that it's fine for a cable news network to air as much as devote as much as half of its news time to one story about one tragedy in Florida?
Well, we can't go into what's right and wrong about these things. Ultimately, this is a business. It's a capitalist institution, and it's about the law and supply and demand. If your viewers are saying that they want more Trayvon Martin or they want more about Michael Jackson, then you've got to be mindful of that. That's just the reality of the news world that we live in today. And to pretend to ignore that, is not being realistic, actually. They're in the business of making money.
I don't actually agree with that. I think that the coverage will die down. I think that the figures, I believe the figures Lola is talking about were for that last week in March. I mean, there was a national outrage over the 6 weeks that passed between the time that this happened and questions and this Zimmerman not being arrested and there not being a trial. I think it will die down. I don't mean any disrespect about that, but to my mind, this is different from giving people Michael Jackson coverage, which I think got pretty darned excessive.
After he died, indeed.
I'm not conflating the two at all. Just saying that right now what we're seeing is that the viewer is more in control of what they want to see on television in a way that they weren't before. The viewer has a lot more power in determining what they want to see on television than they did before. That's all I was arguing.
In this past week, there was this bizarre spectacle of the two former attorneys for George Zimmerman announcing at a news conference that they were leaving the case, that their client wouldn't talk to them, but that he would talk to one person they found out about, a Fox News talk show host. Let's roll the tape of Sean Hannity.
For a few weeks, we have been pursuing an interview with Mr. Zimmerman to give him a chance to tell his side of the story. Now, yesterday, I was contacted by an individual that we, in fact, believe was George Zimmerman. He reached out to me. We spoke on the phone about his case, and I agreed not to report on the contents of that conversation.
Jane, any problem with Sean Hannity having an off-the-record conversation with George Zimmerman, then a potential criminal defendant in the case?
Well, you know, I think everybody in the world was trying to get George Zimmerman. So as a journalist, taking that call, I mean, in the booking, as Lola was saying, I mean, everybody would be after that story. Again, I separate that from the fact that I think Fox was slow to cover this story, and now they're very concerned about Mr. Zimmerman's rights.
Well, I don't have any problem at all with what Sean Hannity did. It's not uncommon for hosts to talk to guests. In fact, in this very story, I talked to a reporter off the record trying to persuade her to come on this program. She was reluctant to step into the crossfire and decided not to. But let me turn to the MSNBC side, because I do, as I flip back and forth between the channels, get the impression that some on Fox are acting as Zimmerman's defense lawyer, Lola, and many on MSNBC, you know, taking Trayvon Martin's side and the side of his family. What do you think about Al Sharpton moving back and forth? He's at a news conference with the parents. He interviews the parents. He's addressing a rally. He's doing his show from Sanford, Florida.
The journalist in me, I have to say, has a bit of a problem with that, because that's just not how I was raised as a journalist. There was this understanding that there had to be pure objectivity. You were not the story. You reported on the story. But I understand in the short time that I've been in the business, in the well over the decade, it's changed completely. And so the businesswoman in me looks at it and says, well, it's a win-win. Al Sharpton is not only a part of the story, he's helping to create the story, and then he gets to report on the story. If these are the new rules of journalism, then I dare any other journalist out there to say to themselves, wow, if I had this opportunity to not only create the story, but report on the story and essentially generate ratings coup for myself, I'm not sure that they would walk away from that and say, I wouldn't do that.
But Jane Hall, I mean, Al Sharpton's entitled to do whatever he wants, but NBC and everyone up to NBC News President Steve Kaplan has defended this, is essentially allowing him to cover himself, to be a participant, an active participant, an out-front participant in the same story that he's covering night after night for that channel.
Well, I agree. You know, I agree with Lola. The lines have moved. The separation between church and state has changed.
Are there any lines at all anymore?
Well, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think it's
lines.
changed. I think
there
what's
are no
tough.
Lines. It's
what's tough is for NBC News.
Basis now. There are no lines.
Right.
There are no lines.
What's tough is for NBC News to now cover this story when they already had the controversy over having to apologize for the inadvertent, apparently, edit out of the story. They've got Al Sharpton. I think it's cable news is pretty bifurcated, with the exception of CNN. I mean, it's pretty much, you know, you are looking for a different point of view on the two sides.
Let me roll some tape.
And Jane, that's the perfect word, point of view. POV is what rules on cable television right now. And the stronger the POV, the more close to the story you are in terms of POV, the better it serves you. Whether you are Team Zimmerman or Team Trayvon Martin, POV reigns.
But in looking at those teams, one team, Trayvon Martin's parents, have been on a lot of television shows. They've been on all the major morning shows. Now, they can do whatever they want. Everybody in the world, including me, has great sympathy for them. But since Zimmerman chose not to speak out, and of course his lawyers, I'm sure, didn't want him to, does that give their side an advantage because, you know, you've got these grieving parents working the circuit? Well,
you know, it's so hard not to be cynical about people, but everything that I've read, and a reporter that I saw interviewed on the Daily Beast from Newsweek said his mother is as she comes across, trying to hold it together. Mm-hmm. They went public with this to try to get a trial and an arrest.
Yes,
so, you know, it's hard to argue with that.
And they have every right to do that. Lola, brief comment from you.
They did everything that a parent would do. If they felt like they weren't getting justice, it's by any means necessary. If you have to go to the media and appear on the media every day to ensure that there's justice being sought for your child, I think any grieving mother, any grieving father, any responsible parent would do that. I don't fault them. In fact, I think they've handled themselves with the utmost dignity and grace.
Right. I wasn't faulting. I was just saying that perhaps it gave their side an advantage. We will follow this story as it heads to trial. And boy, with cameras in the courtroom, that could be quite a spectacle. Lola Ogunaki, Jane Hall, thanks for joining us. When we come back, Joe Muto, better known as the Fox News mole, speaks to us exclusively about why he became a leaker and blew up his career. And later, Steve Kroft and Bob Simon of 60 Minutes.